My name is Margaret Drabble and I'm a novelist and I write mostly novels, but this book, A Writer's Britain, is non-fiction. It's about landscape, but it's about writers who've written about the landscape. And I so enjoyed writing it because one of the things I love doing most is being a tourist and going and looking at places and having an excuse to go somewhere new. So I had a lot of fun writing the book. The thing I enjoy most is actually being asked to go and look at a new place and write about it. I still find the adventure of going even to somewhere that's not very beautiful, like Stoke-on-Trent, exciting, because you can see things that other people don't see and you can create a landscape in words. And I just find that aspect of writing very satisfying. The time span begins really at the beginning of English literature and slightly earlier, because I've got some Roman quotations, Hadrian's Wall, descriptions of landscape really before we were talking English at all. There's some Welsh, in translation, poetry from the 7th or 8th century about the Welsh valleys, beekeeping. They were very nature-loving, the Welsh saints, so there's a lot of nature poetry in Welsh from that period. So it begins really with the sense of landscape as a religious experience. The monks, as we know, always chose a beautiful place to build a monastery or an abbey, partly because of the water flowing through the river, but partly because they had an eye for beauty. Some of the favourite places that I visited, there's the Lake District, which of course was made very famous by the Lake poets, Wordsworth and Coleridge, but they also spent a lot of time in the West Country, which I really love. So there's a lot of Somerset in the book, a lot of the Quantocks, the Valley of Rocks, where Wordsworth and Coleridge and Southey used to walk along, writing their poetry as they walked. And I do a lot of those walks now, and the landscape is just sublime. It's very interesting, the history of how people have written about landscape, because in the Middle Ages we didn't really like the wild landscape at all. We were frightened of forests, we liked walled gardens, we liked everything to be safe. We liked castles because you could see out of them and see whether the enemy was coming, but we didn't really like forests or mountains. And as time went on, that changed completely, and it's partly affected by the writers who wrote about it, and of course the painters who painted it. And so we moved from the picturesque to the romantic, and you find Wordsworth describing Snowdonia as beautiful, whereas Dr. Johnson thought it was awful, and Dr. Johnson thought that the Highlands of Scotland were very barren and bleak. He didn't see the beauty in them, whereas in the Victorian period after Wordsworth, Queen Victoria loved the Highlands, and in fact she invented them in a way. She wrote very well about them. Walter Scott was very drawn towards the lowlands and Melrose. If you would see fair Melrose right, go visit it by pale moonlight, which I've never done, but every Scot knows that little verse. So there are some famous beauty spots that Walter Scott put on the map, and people go and look at them now. There are other places of very great beauty that haven't been so much written about, and I was very interested doing the research for this book that I couldn't find enough on Wales. And then I realised that this was because the Welsh wrote in the Welsh language. I couldn't find any classic Welsh writer writing about it until quite recently I discovered some wonderful Welsh writing by a writer called John Cooper Powys, who I think is a very great landscape writer. But he wrote in English, which meant that I could quote from him and follow his footsteps as well. I have put in some new material about writers that I discovered more recently, like John Cooper Powys. There are also some very nice descriptions of allotment gardening that are new, because my son Joe Swift does gardening on television and he has an allotment, and he wrote a book called Joe's Allotment, and I became very much better informed about allotments. There is quite a lot about gardening, but usually when people write about landscape and garden, they write about very grand gardens, and I thought actually the allotment garden is very interesting, and people have written some very fine poems about allotments. So there's new material inspired by my son Joe. I think the history of how certain houses and certain landscapes came to be perceived as romantic rather than ugly and barren is in itself very interesting. So I think my book would appeal to anybody who likes pottering around and looking at places, buildings, a bit of literary history.